Now, every cinema has a special character, but in the West End, there's one special character that everybody comes to see when they're passing the cinema. They come in and say hello to our John, and here's our John Higgins. Tell us a bit about yourself, John.
I come from the Lake District, but unfortunately, my parents were elderly and they didn't believe in the cinema. So, what did I do? I rebelled and come to London, decided to work in the cinema. So apparently, the customers, when they come to the Empire, I'm the only door who actually speaks to anyone. But I do enjoy talking and meeting the public.
And you've had people actually write letters to you, haven't you, and wanting to do a documentary on you in the past?
Oh yes. It all started when ITV documentary, when was that? And then a BBC Two radio interview, and then 4 years ago someone made a video, 6 people who enjoyed the job in London, and that my talent was wasted. I should have taken up acting.
And
Channel 4.
Yeah, isn't it true, John, that you're in Yellow Pages, the London edition of Yellow Pages, and there's a photograph of you?
Oh yeah, the Yellow Pages, yeah. And then one magazine, then Time Out, where you readers think I'm the jovial mountain storm who adds character to the West End. You know, one of their readers from Time Out wrote, the West End is a place to see a film, but at the Empire, the jovial mountain storm adds character to cinema. Oh dear. Then the Evening Standard wrote an article about the Empire, and they put me in at the beginning of the article. Apparently I'm a porter cabin with a fair clear voice, and I'm perfect for children and adults alike. The Evening Standard, that was June 96, and then I had offers to do the Earhorn Insurance, Euro 96. But I turned them down, unfortunately. I have arthritis now. I haven't been too good with that. But British Film News, they did an interview. Apparently I'm one of the most famous characters in Leicester Square. And then we have Yellow Pages. And then before Christmas last year, some students were in. I represent the spirit of London. But this is just some of the things, you know, and I have really enjoyed working in cinema.
How long have you been at the Empire, John?
January 81, 17 years.
And what was the first cinema or theatre you worked at when you came to London?
The JC, the news theatres. London used to have quite a number of news theatres those days, way back in the 60s when I come to London. And I didn't know what a doorman was coming from the sticks in the Lake District.
Were you amazed with all the bright lights and the number of cinemas?
I just couldn't believe it, you know. You get paid for standing.
Hello there. All right.
I couldn't believe it, you know, that they have people just stand outside.
Yes.
You know.
And where did you work after the JCs?
I was at JC for a year, then I went to Cinerama. One of the managers from the JC News Theatre went to Cinerama.
Yes. Was that the one in Old Compton Street, which is now the Prince Edward Theatre?
Prince Edward Theatre. And then Chris Green.
Do you think it's around over?
Then I moved to London Experience.
Oh, that was in the what is now the Trocadero, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's right, owned by EMI.
And then if I closed, then Chris Green, who I used to work for at Cinerama, offered me a job at the Empire. But since I've been at the Empire for the last 17 years, it's just flown by. I've really enjoyed being here.
And you've seen all the big stars, all the big directors coming in on premieres.
That's right.
Would you have changed your life again?
No, I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, now during this interview we hear somebody shout hello. Now we've got a character standing to the left of me called Paul. Paul, walk over to John and say hello.
Hello, John.
Good morning, Paul.
Now Paul, this is a character that comes into the West End to see every single film that ever opens up, and if you don't see him on the first 2 days of a film, we get worried. We think he might be sick.
I think I might have died or tried to get infection somewhere else. But no, I usually turn up within those first 2 days.
And isn't it true that, Paul, you will actually see a film sometimes, or a couple of times,
Or at least, if I like them a lot,
Yes.
you know, something like Titanic,
Yes.
something like that, then I will definitely see it 2, sometimes even 3 times.
And you might even go to 2 different cinemas to see it.
Oh yes, to compare the sound and the presentation of the film.
Yeah, yeah. Which is your favourite West End cinema?
Without a doubt, it has to be the Empire, Leicester Square.
Thank you for saying that, Paul. We do appreciate that. And you are a 70mm fan.
Yes, absolutely. I only wish that there were more 70mm films around, but unfortunately, as I say, the process being so expensive as it is, very few, you know, films ever actually go to that expense. Thankfully, they did. They did it in did it for Titanic, and with the success of it, hopefully, it will encourage other producers to actually go for 70mm presentations of films and bring back the big spectacle that there's a whole idea of going to the cinema.
That's brilliant. And this gentleman, Paul, he comes in and he always asks, is a film in scope, is it in DTS, is it in SRD, SDDS, and that is really nice. This guy knows what he's on about.
It's a whole idea. As I say, I like to know. I prefer seeing. I must admit that if it was up to me, I would have most films in scope anyway, because to me that's the most cinematic way of actually presenting any film.
Yes. Do you not think, though, that certain films need the intimacy of a 1:5 standard ratio?
To a certain extent, but it still reeks, to a certain extent, to me, of a little bit too much like television. Television does that anyway. When you go to the cinema, I think even intimate films can be done on the big scale. I mean, David Lean often, I mean, even with something like Ryan's Daughter, which to a certain extent could have been filmed in 1:85, he went to 70mm on that, and that was a very kind of intimate picture. So I don't think it necessarily matters. I just think that if you've got a filmmaker who's good enough at composing good film and good pictures, then he should be able to fill easily a scope screen.
Yes.
Very few, and as I say, apart from the ones that do it, a lot of them shy away from it because they don't take the time and the trouble to compose the backgrounds as well as the foregrounds.
Oh, that's interesting, Paul. Who's your favourite director?
My favourite director, gosh, that's a difficult one because I like films from different directors in different things. I love David Lean. He's a wonderful, as I say, a wonderful composer of films. There's no two ways about that. Gosh, Hitchcock is also another great favourite, I must admit.
Well,
James Cameron is excellent for composing spectacles as well. As I say, it's very difficult to pin down one particular director because I have so many favourite films anyway that it's almost impossible to say one is necessarily better than another.
Do you think certain directors can film things better than other directors? Say Alan Parker at Evita. I personally think nobody else could have filmed Evita the way he did.
No, he did do a very good job on that, and I was glad for once that he actually went into doing it in scope. Because, as I say, for a long time now anyway, in fact, the first one I think he's done in scope, actually most of his films have been in 1:85, and I was hoping that he was going to open it out a bit, which he did, and made it into a spectacle, which is what it should have been.
Absolutely.
It definitely should have been in 70mm though, there's no two ways about that.
Well, again, we're down to the cost.
It again would have benefited from it, but as I said a few minutes ago, hopefully with the success of Titanic, we'll see a lot more films, I hope, in 70mm. Including, I hope, at some stage, all the Star Wars films after they were reissued last year in just 35mm print.
Well, Star Wars, the first one, Star Wars itself, was actually 70mm in the States. I don't know how many prints, but there were some available.
This is it.
Yes.
The Americans have in fact had quite a few 70mm prints over the years, which we've never got round to seeing. I understand that True Lies was there was a 70mm print of that,
yes,
which we never got here.
That's right.
So hopefully we will actually get to see some of these films which we've been deprived of over the years. I mean, there's a whole list of films that we've kind of missed, good prints on lately. I can count El Cid for one, and Ben-Hur as well, which have been restored and which haven't had an opening in this country. And this was several years ago.
That's right, yes.
So it would be nice to see these again, presented properly in 70mm at a cinema big enough really to take the spectacle.
Well, you do know this year Greece has been reissued,
yes.
Up to now, I've not heard that there's no 70mm.
In 70mm,
no,
as it was
no.
when it first came round here
That's right.
at the Empire.
I came down from Liverpool 20 years ago to see it here.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. I mean, it's a bit of a retrograde step when you consider that 20 years ago we were seeing things on bigger screens, and now, to a certain extent, except when we go to the bigger screens, we're having to see stuff on smaller screens. I think, as I say, we are taking a bit of a retrograde step, and we really do need to now capitalise on the success, certainly of Titanic, of making more spectacle-like films. And I think bringing back 70mm is certainly going to be one of the best ideas for that. It'll hopefully encourage a new generation to see what we, in our youth, used to marvel at, which, as I say, kids nowadays hardly ever knew. I mean, as I say, unless you went to London, to the Odeon Leicester Square, you wouldn't have had the chance to see Titanic. But
that's
hopefully,
true.
when it finishes its run at the Odeon Leicester Square on March the 27th, it will, one hopes, come to the Empire.
No, it's nobody knows at the moment.
Not sure.
Well, it's not out. It's either the Warner, Shaftesbury Avenue, or the Plaza. That's the general rumour.
But there's only one 70mm print actually to go around.
Yes.
So consequently, if that one, as I say, wherever that goes, the rest will just be left with ordinary 35mm prints. And
That's
a
right.
great shame.
But it must be said, however, the 35mm prints are really very good. But when you see the 70mm, it's so superb on it.
Oh yes, it is. It is particularly superb on this. It was beautifully shot. I mean, another thing one can actually say about it is the fact that it's brightly lit, as opposed to the common tendency these days is to shoot rather darkly. And on Panavision, on widescreen Panavision, it's always a bit of a waste of time really. You've got a wonderful big screen, and to make it too dark, the whole film, it always seems to me a terrible idea. Clint Eastwood's a bit of a bad horse on this sometimes. He shoots a little too darkly. I'm thinking of films like Pale Rider and what he made several years ago based on the, what was that called? Firefox, which was incredibly dark.
Pale Rider was really bad. They sent a letter around with that.
This is it. But Clint Eastwood's done this on many occasions, actually, when he's shot in scope. Almost pointless actually shooting in that format if you're not going to be able to see it. In fact, in any format, if you're actually going to shoot too darkly.
But they say they're creating atmosphere, they say.
But it doesn't really create so much an atmosphere. What it does create, really, certainly in a darkened cinema, is a soporific effect, which isn't very good. The whole idea when you're actually in a cinema is that you should get variation in light and shade. You don't want any one film to be totally dark all the way through. The whole idea of cinema is that it should have variation. As soon as you see one scene, then basically you don't need to see that scene again. You've seen it. You need to move on to something else. The visual alterations make the film interesting. This is basically it.
Now, Paul, talking about big screens and big formats, have you been to the new IMAX in the Trocadero?
I haven't yet. Basically, I haven't really got around to it because there have been so many other films I've had to see first. But I'm hoping to get around to it certainly this week because they're changing the programme, so I want to catch those before they actually... one of them is actually changing the programme.
Everest is a new one going in.
Everest is the one going in. I'm looking forward at the moment to the new IMAX going up at Waterloo and hoping that we are going to get to see a lot of 70mm prints that we've been deprived of.
Are you referring to not IMAX 70mm prints? Do you mean they'll show normal shows other than IMAX presentation?
That's correct, yes. Basically 70mm prints of the old epics, things like 2001, Lawrence of Arabia, Oklahoma, which is just, I believe, is just about to be shown soon in Bradford in 70mm, a new print, I believe, of Oklahoma.
Will that be in 30 frames a second as it was shot, do you think?
I'm not sure. I don't know the full details on that one, but hopefully, as I say, if they've got the print, we should hopefully, at some stage anyway, get a print of that down here. It will be very nice, certainly, with something like Titanic, for example, which undoubtedly will appear at the IMAX several years later, several years down the line, once it's opened, we'll be getting the chance to see that in 70mm. That should be quite interesting.
You know Titanic, we keep going back, Titanic played the Royal Film Performance at the Empire last year.
That's correct, yes.
And that looks stunning in 70mm here.
I'm sure it did, yeah. This is it. It would be almost a criminal crime, actually, not to show it here in 70mm. It's a lovely cinema, and you really do need to show... as I say, In and Out was just a 185 presentation, and so is Amistad. So it would be nice to see something in scope again, basically, here. Well, not only scope, but also in 70mm. We haven't had anything in here for quite a while, actually, now, in 70mm. And certainly that would be an interesting thing to have a look at, definitely.
We do sort of some private shows. We've had Hamlet and 70mm for the cast and crew, but that was a private screening, you know, likewise the Titanic for the Royal. Yeah, and Hamlet looks absolutely superb.
Well, the wonderful thing about Hamlet was that it was actually shot in 70mm. So there's also quite a difference here. As films that are just pumped up, for example, Titanic is actually just blown up from a 35mm print. So if you're actually shooting in 70mm, the process should hopefully give you a sharper picture. Hasn't always, though, necessarily. Thinking back to Far and Away.
That was a bit of a disappointment.
It was. The only sequence where I honestly thought that you did have quite a sharper picture was certainly in the race across the plains at the end.
Yes.
That looked quite sharp. But the rest of the film, unfortunately, since they decided to introduce a kind of smoky feel to it, and certainly in the early scenes and the boxing scenes, it didn't really then benefit too much from the 70mm. But I must admit, in Hamlet, there was certainly quite a sharp picture in there, largely because, as I say, Branagh had shot in a kind of light, bright environment, which was perfectly suited for 70mm. If you're shooting in that format, it's best to light it nice and bright so you can actually see things beautifully. And it doesn't necessarily detract away from the atmosphere you're trying to...
Did you know on the shoot for Hamlet they actually got the old TodayO cameras thrown in from the States?
I didn't really know.
And some of the night shots were actually shot at night. It wasn't sort of optically perfected later on.
I didn't realise that.
And one of the cameras actually stopped working because of the cold.
I really didn't know.
Yeah.
Now, as I say, I adore films that are actually shot in 70 or even Super 70, which is actually now virtually defunct. I mean, no one shoots in that format now.
Except Stanley Kubrick, camera 65 for Eyes
yes.
Wide Shut.
Yes, absolutely. Super 70, is it really?
It's 70mm, yes.
Is it?
Filmed in camera 65, which is 70mm, yes.
Oh, right, so it's going to be widescreen and everything, is it?
Well, one assumes so.
Well,
It's no one knows
Not
anything,
necessarily, because
but it's
he
shot.
He hasn't done anything actually widescreen since, what was the last one? It would have been 2001, I think.
That's right.
That was the last one he actually shot in, well, that was actually shot in Super 70. But,
Yes.
I mean, all his recent films have been, the 185 format, things like Shining and
Yes.
Full Metal Jacket.
That's right.
And even Barry Lyndon. Actually, Barry Lyndon is one I think would have certainly actually benefited greatly from Super 70.
Well, that was a bright picture, wasn't it?
It was a bright picture, yes. It would have been interesting to have seen Super 70, I must admit. But certainly 2001, which you did actually have here several years ago, it wasn't a particularly good print here actually when you had it. The 35, it's a little bit scratchy, just slightly.
But did you know, were you here about 3 years ago when we showed it for a one-off screening of 2001?
I was.
And that was 35mm print,
Yeah.
and it was in Dolby A, where originally the 35mm was just mono, and it's been done in Dolby A. Yeah.
But it was. I must admit, when I did come here, it was very nice to see you actually play the exit music and still keep the intermission. Well, obviously
Absolutely.
But the exit music, it was lovely to hear that was still, part of the presentation, because of course in those days you didn't have the endless credits that you have now.
That's right.
Everything from the personal driver of the actors and everything. You didn't have that back then, so you had basically exit music, which a lot of people now obviously don't realise that was one of the things that you had on these films, and so most people just get up and go when they see the end come up on a lot of these 60s films. But I wait and hear the end, the exit music before I go.
It's interesting to say about intermission pictures, Paul, because when I started in the business, you had all these big epics, and you always had a play in before part one.
Absolutely, yes.
Then you had the intermission,
Correct.
a play in before
On
part
track,
two, and a play out. And we used to close the tabs at the end of the trailers,
Absolutely.
just put the stage lights up, no house lights. Then normally it was a dramatic play-in piece of music.
Absolutely,
And then
usually
that
from the film.
Always from the film, and then that got people into the sort of mood of it.
course, yeah.
And then when we came to the intermission, we played no interval music. Say the intermission was 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden we hit with the play-in again, and people knew it was ready. Let's get settled down and go. So you're absolutely right.
It was extremely effective, and as I say, having the intermission was a very, very useful thing in those days. Actually, it was actually incorporated into the film as they were making it. Nowadays, they tend to actually make a film with the thought largely that they'll be cutting it down to at least 2 hours. But in those days, they knew that they were making a 3.5 hour picture, so the actual intermission, the break in the film,
was part of the film,
integrated into the film,
and it led into the intermission.
I mean, you only have to look at things like 2001 or Lawrence of Arabia. There are definite breaks.
Sound of Music, Zhivago.
Sound of Music, Zhivago.
Beautiful
all
intervals.
These films
yes.
were purposely built with even a shorter epic like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was in 70mm and was only 2 hours 19 minutes. Even that had an intermission,
That's
which
right.
actually caught a lot of people on the hop. Actually, when you actually did have an intermission here several years ago when you played it, because most people are
not used to it now.
Not prepared for seeing a film that's only 2 hours 19 having an intermission.
That's right.
But I knew it was coming up, or at least I was sincerely hoping it was coming up, because that was a definite break in that picture. But unfortunately, they don't go for this now so much. I mean, the film it's almost difficult to see where you would be able to give a complete break on a film. But I certainly sadly miss those days. Hopefully, as I say, if films get any longer than 3 hours, then we'll certainly have to have one. Obviously, Hamlet had to have one, obviously the Kenneth Branagh's version, because it was a 4-hour epic.
Yes.
And that would have certainly benefited from having an intermission.
Absolutely, and there was technical reasons why, because the film was so long, you couldn't get it all on the platter, so you had to have an interval to relace up.
There's one film playing at the moment which I think has been totally overlooked and undetected by the critics, and that is Kevin Costner's The Postman, which I think is an excellent epic. And I would honestly recommend anyone to go along and see it. It's been totally overlooked. They've actually criticised him rather than the film.
Right.
It's a beautifully constructed epic. And as I say, I always think it's easier to do an hour and a half film than ever it is to do a 3-hour epic. To be actually able to control all those elements and to still come up with something that's very, very good and moves reasonably well is a very difficult thing to pull off. And Kevin Costner does it spectacularly. His directorial abilities have improved immeasurably since Dances with Wolves several years ago.
Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for coming into the Empire. Would you, let's hope you keep coming to see this beautiful theatre.
I sincerely hope that the powers that be never ever consider breaking up the Empire into a huge multiplex, because the Empire Screen one is certainly one of the most luxurious cinemas, and certainly has got the most comfortable seating that I've ever been in. And it would be absolutely terrible if they ever decided to break it up into various screens.
Why, have you heard rumours that they might?
I certainly have heard rumours that this might well possibly happen, but I sincerely hope that it doesn't, because we've got few enough large screens left as it is, and we are going to need these hopefully in the years ahead, when hopefully we'll have other films to rival Titanic in scope and size. We are going to need these big screens, and if they're all cut up, it's going to be very, very difficult to get back to them.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's been great to interview you.
A pleasure.
And thank you to our John here. See you again, Paul. What film are you going to see today?
I'm having a look at Morgan Freeman's new one, Kiss the Girls.
Oh, I'm sure you enjoy that. It's very good. We've shown that here on private screenings as well. It's very good.
Yes, but as I say, I should be looking forward to your next production scene, which I think is Mouse Hunt. I think that's your next one in here, which hopefully is going into number
one, yes. Got a premiere for that.
So I should be looking forward to that, and as I say, I've never ever had any problems with this cinema, and it's sound-wise and presentation-wise, and certainly the staff are always very, very helpful here. It's a pleasure to come here always.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Enjoy yourself.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.